Rick and Morty is one of the most successful adult cartoons ever made. Its theme song was written for a show that never aired. Rick's burp started as a recording accident. One line of dialogue turned a discontinued McDonald's sauce into a national event. In this video, we break down some of Rick and Morty's most obscure facts ever. The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Mahardy. Justin Roiland uploaded The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Mahardy in October 2006, and the primary reason for that short's existence was to annoy as many lawyers as humanly possible. Roiland had been making an animated series called House of Cosby's for the Channel 101 Short Film Festival in Los Angeles, and Bill Cosby's legal team had shut it down with a cease and desist letter. His response was to immediately start working on something new and deliberately more offensive. That decision would eventually lead, after 7 years of quiet development, to Rick and Morty. Channel 101 was a non-profit short film festival that Dan Harmon and his collaborator Rob Schrab co-founded in Los Angeles in the early 2000s. Its format had nothing in common with how mainstream television development worked. Every month, filmmakers submitted 5-minute television-style pilots. The audience screened everything together in a single sitting, and then they voted on which shows came back for another episode the following month. If the audience wanted more, the creator made more. If they didn't vote for a show, the series was finished, with no discussion and no appeals. There were no development notes, no network executives filtering decisions, no lengthy revision process. The feedback loop between creator and audience was compressed into a single evening, which meant that a creator could absorb the response to one project and already be working on the next before any traditional development process would have even scheduled a meeting. For independent animators and comedians trying to find an audience in Los Angeles without industry connections, it was one of the few environments in the city that actually rewarded trying strange things. Roiland had moved to Los Angeles from Stockton, California, with a group of friends who had been making videos together since their college years. The group had produced local commercials with animated elements, shot short films on limited budgets, and built a practice around creating content without waiting for permission or funding from any outside institution. When they discovered Channel 101, they recognized it as a venue built for exactly that approach. Submissions didn't need to be polished or commercial. Channel 101 audiences specifically responded to work that felt specific and honest rather than produced and calculated. The monthly production rhythm suited Roiland particularly well. He worked quickly, generated ideas prolifically, and found the pace of trying something, getting an immediate reaction, and moving on to the next project far more productive than sitting with a single idea for months waiting for a development deal. What the Channel 101 experience gave Roiland, beyond audience access, was a practical education in what worked and what didn't, built through real testing rather than theory. Most writers and animators at his level were developing work in relative isolation, without any clear sense of whether the choices they were making were landing until the work was finished and already public. At Channel 101, that feedback loop was compressed into a single evening every month. Over the years, he was regularly submitting work. He was learning through direct observation which kinds of voice performances made the Channel 101 audience laugh, and which ones left them flat, which character dynamics felt real and interesting, and which ones felt mechanical. That accumulated knowledge, informal and entirely practical, shaped his creative instincts in ways that would not be obvious in the finished product of anything he later made, but were present in every choice. House of Cosby's premiered at Channel 101 in January 2005 and quickly became the most talked about project the festival had produced. The premise followed a man who had obtained one of Bill Cosby's hairs and used it to construct a cloning machine, generating a growing series of Cosby duplicates with different abilities. Dan Harmon, Channel 101's co-founder, voiced one of the clones. That detail gives a sense of how closely the community operated. The person who had built the venue was appearing in the work of its participants. The show spread online beyond the festival's usual audience, reaching viewers who had no connection to Channel 101 but found the clips funny enough to share. That wider distribution attracted legal attention. In June 2005, Roiland received cease and desist correspondence from Bill Cosby's legal team demanding he stop production immediately. He complied. House of Cosby's ended after 4 episodes. Receiving a cease and desist for a 5-minute animated parody series made for a non-profit film festival was, objectively, disproportionate. House of Cosby's had no commercial dimension, no distribution deal, and no realistic capacity to cause measurable harm to Bill Cosby's commercial interests or public reputation. The legal action was a blunt instrument applied to something that posed no genuine threat, and it worked primarily because Roiland was not in a position to contest it. He understood that completely. Rather than absorbing the cease and desist as a lesson in caution, he processed it as a demonstration of how copyright enforcement could be applied disproportionately to obviously harmless creative work, and he decided the most effective response was to make the dynamic visible again, this time against a target large enough that any legal response would be even harder to justify. Back to the Future was the franchise he chose. Universal Studios controlled the property, and the appeal was partly in the scale of the target. A studio with resources large enough that any legal response to a small animated parody would look more disproportionate than if the same response came from an individual's legal team. Roiland initially considered giving the project a title so nakedly confrontational it functioned essentially as a written legal challenge. He pulled back from that approach and settled on the real animated adventures of Doc and Mahardy, adjusting the character names just enough to provide a thin legal buffer while keeping the parody clearly readable to anyone who had seen the source material. Doc Brown became Doc Smith. Marty McFly became Hardy McDonald's. The absurdity of the adjusted spellings was itself a comment on what those adjustments were meant to accomplish, name changes as legal fiction rather than meaningful distinction. The character designs remained visually connected to the source material in ways that left no real ambiguity about what was being parodied. Crude from the opening scene, the short was built around a deliberately provocative premise. The plot involved the scientist character instructing the younger companion to perform degrading physical tasks as a mechanism for time travel, and the whole thing was delivered in a flat, deadpan register. The characters spoke to each other as though what was happening was entirely unremarkable, and that commitment to treating the absurd as mundane gave the short its specific, uncomfortable quality. The shock content wasn't played for any obvious winking. It just happened, plainly and matter-of-factly, and the flatness of the performance made it stranger than an exaggerated comedic delivery would have. That tonal quality, the gap between what was being described and how it was being described, had almost everything to do with how Roiland recorded the voices. Both characters were recorded by Roiland himself in a single session, switching between the scientist voice and the younger companion voice, without any other voice actors in the room. He had been developing a sense of both archetypes across his various Channel 101 submissions, experimenting with different vocal qualities to find what generated the reactions he was looking for. For the scientist, he was after something specific, a voice that communicated raw intelligence, operating under obvious impairment, someone whose thoughts arrived faster than the words to express them, someone who had entirely stopped trying to regulate how they came across. While recording one of the scientist's lines, mid-sentence, he burped. The normal response in a voice recording session is to stop, maybe laugh, maybe apologize, and redo the take from the top. Roiland continued instead. He kept talking straight through the burp, folding it into the performance, rather than treating it as an interruption, and what came out of the microphone sounded different from anything he had recorded before. The character felt real, like an actual person, rather than a performed cartoon voice, disheveled and impaired, and somehow still accurate. He kept the take, and that decision defined one of the most recognizable character voices in animation for the next decade and beyond. Somewhere inside that kept take was the beginning of a character philosophy. A voice that could burp mid-sentence, while still delivering accurate and important information, was communicating something specific about its relationship to composure. The character had entirely abandoned any concern with it. Rick was always operating beyond the normal social expectations that govern how people present themselves, too far along in his own understanding of the world to care about the mechanics of how that understanding came across. The burp made that visible in the simplest possible way. Here was a character who was not managing his presentation, who didn't have the bandwidth for it, who was moving too fast and too far to perform the basic social maintenance that most people maintain without thinking. That character quality was set in October 2006, in a recording session for a crude parody short, years before Roiland had any formal name for the character, or any clear plan for where the voice might go. When the short screened at Channel 101 and wasn't voted back for more episodes, Roiland did not treat that as a conclusion. He returned to the characters repeatedly over the following years, creating additional shorts in various contexts, with no direct plan connecting them to a television career. One of those later shorts was made to help promote the comic series Scud, the Disposable Assassin, which needed promotional material and provided Roiland a framework to work with the voices again. Another was produced specifically to celebrate the creative culture at Channel 101. A third became a Gatorade commercial. The situations changed, the lengths varied, and the quality ranged from deliberately rough to polished, but the core dynamic between the two characters remained consistent. The older figure with too much knowledge and too little caution, the younger one with too little understanding and too much anxiety. No matter what scenario Roiland placed them in, they kept producing material. The gap between their respective levels of understanding kept generating situations that could be played for comedy, danger, or both at once. Dan Harmon's professional path had taken a different shape during those same years. After building Channel 101 into an established institution for independent filmmaking in Los Angeles, he created Community, a sitcom for NBC about a community college study group. The show ran from 2009 through 2015, developing a loyal audience and a critical reputation for comedy writing that was structurally ambitious and interested in its own formal mechanics, in ways that mainstream network sitcoms rarely attempted. The production history was troubled. NBC removed Harmon from his own show at the end of the third season, citing concerns about the production environment. He returned for later seasons, but the experience had permanently changed his relationship with how network television operated and what it required from its creators. When Adult Swim reached out in 2012 about creating a new animated series, he was interested, partly because the network's production culture was so different from what he had experienced at NBC, and partly because the creative freedom Adult Swim extended to its producers was unlike anything available in mainstream network television. Beyond that creative culture, Adult Swim also offered something Harmon had not had at NBC, a built-in tolerance for storytelling that didn't resolve cleanly. The network's most successful shows had demonstrated that an audience existed for animated comedy, where the rules could shift between episodes, where the stakes varied from real to absurd depending on the week, and where characters could carry damage from one episode into the next or forget it entirely. That was not a flaw in those shows. It reflected the specific sensibility of both the creators and the audience they had built a relationship with over years of consistent programming. Rick and Morty would eventually push against even that tolerance, building real serialized continuity into a format that conventionally resisted it. But the foundation for that ambition was laid by the culture Adult Swim had developed long before Rick and Morty existed. Adult Swim had spent over a decade cultivating a specific audience and a specific tolerance for creative risk. The late-night programming block had built its identity around animated series that didn't fit anywhere else on television. Shows like Aqua Teen Hunger Force, Space Ghost Coast to Coast, and The Venture Bros, which operated with sensibilities too strange and too self-aware for any other broadcast context. The audience Adult Swim had assembled was late-night, college-aged, and specifically accustomed to comedy that didn't explain itself, that rewarded attention rather than passive consumption, and that was willing to go places mainstream animation avoided. The network's production model gave creators more time and more latitude than network television typically allowed, which meant the work could be stranger and more specific than anything that had to pass through a conventional development process. For a project built on character voices, developed in rough festival shorts, it was almost exactly the right home. Harmon called Roiland with the Adult Swim opportunity, and the timing was specific and useful. Roiland had just completed 3 animated pilot projects for Fox that had all failed to get picked up for series. He was between projects, motivated to get something made, and had 6 years of Doc and Hardy material, representing a substantial investment in 2 specific characters. He brought the voices immediately to the Adult Swim project. The character names changed to Rick and Morty. A family context was built around the pair that hadn't existed in the festival shorts, including a household, a daughter, a son-in-law, a granddaughter, and a suburb. And that context gave the show a domestic anchor that kept the more extreme science fiction elements from feeling arbitrary. Harmon brought his structural approach to episode writing, building a framework that gave each episode's chaos a consistent underlying shape. The one significant concern Adult Swim raised was about Roiland voicing both lead characters. Harmon addressed that directly by writing 4 separate story premises demonstrating Morty as a distinct character with his own arc and specific qualities. The network was satisfied. On December 2nd, 2013, Rick and Morty appeared on Adult Swim for the first time. The first season ran 11 episodes on Sunday nights, and the initial audience was modest, around 2 million viewers per episode, a respectable but unremarkable number by cable animation standards. The viewers who did find the show during that first season responded with an unusual intensity. They rewatched episodes, built online communities, wrote analysis, and treated the show as something to study rather than simply consume. What those first viewers couldn't see in the finished product was where any of it had actually come from. The animation was professional, the writing was sharp, and the voices were as polished and precise as anything else in adult animation at the time. Nothing about the finished show suggested that its main character's most defining trait had been set by a mid-sentence burp in a recording session for a crude festival short in 2006, or that the 2 lead characters had spent 7 years being tested in rough animated parodies made to annoy copyright lawyers. The first episode just started, and Rick Sanchez opened his mouth, and somewhere inside the voice was the accident that had started everything. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, the Rick and Morty theme song is one of the most recognizable pieces of animated television music ever made. What almost nobody knows is that it was written for a completely different show, and it only ended up on Rick and Morty because nobody ever got around to replacing it. Section 2, the theme that almost wasn't Ryan Elder, wrote the Rick and Morty theme in 2006, and he wrote it for a completely different show. The project was called Dog World, an animated concept Justin Roiland had developed for Cartoon Network about an alternate Earth where dogs had evolved into the dominant intelligent species and humans lived as their household pets. Cartoon Network passed on it. When Roiland and Dan Harmon were putting together the Rick and Morty pilot several years later, Elder offered the Dog World theme as a temporary placeholder, and that temporary solution became permanent. Before any of that happened, Elder had been building a career in commercial music production in Los Angeles. His work was broad in the way commercial music work almost always requires advertising scores, short-form production pieces, commissions for television projects at various early stages of development. That range had given him a practical fluency for moving between entirely different tones and genres without becoming fixed in any single approach. A brief might ask for something tense and cinematic one week and something light and propulsive the next, and the job was simply to understand what each project needed and deliver it. Developing that kind of flexibility required a working relationship with a wide library of influences across different periods of film and television music. Elder had been assembling that library for years, studying the work of composers who had built the sound vocabulary of science fiction on screen, and that accumulated knowledge would eventually become the foundation for everything he brought to Rick and Morty. Elder's connection to Roiland came through the Channel 101 community. His wife had told him about the festival and its monthly screenings, and through that avenue, he found his way into the social ecosystem that had formed around the event. By the time Elder arrived, Channel 101 had developed a specific quality as a creative community. The monthly screening format had created a shared rhythm for everyone regularly involved. Make something, show it publicly, receive an immediate response, move on to the next thing. That cycle, repeated month after month, had built relationships between participants based on a mutual understanding of creative practice that was harder to develop in more conventional professional environments. The community that formed around those evenings was small enough that people knew each other's work well, and the recurring nature of the screenings meant those relationships deepened over time, rather than remaining superficial. Elder met Roiland through that context, found the working dynamic productive from early on, and received his first commissions for music from projects that Roiland was developing alongside his festival submissions. Dogworld, when Roiland brought it to Elder as a project that needed a theme, was a genuine television pitch rather than a festival short. The premise operated on a simple visual inversion. Earth, recognizable in almost every physical detail, but with the positions of dogs and humans reversed. Dogs walked upright, built cities, wore clothes, held jobs, maintained social hierarchies, and kept small domesticated humans in their homes. The humans in this world behaved with the kind of cheerful dependency that dogs in the real world display: loyal, affectionate, uncomprehending of the larger systems surrounding them, content within the bounded world of their households. The comedy available in that inversion was obvious, but the premise had enough internal logic to support actual storytelling. Questions about what a society built by dog intelligence would look like, what its cultural institutions might be, what its class structures and anxieties would resemble, all of those questions were available to an animated series willing to take the premise seriously rather than using it only for a string of sight gags. Cartoon Network heard the pitch and decided not to move forward. The decision may have come down to the premise feeling too narrow to sustain a long-running series, or to the show's specific tone not matching what the network wanted at that particular moment. The stated reasons, if there were any, have not been documented in a way that makes them available now. What is clear is that Dogworld ended at the pitch stage, and Elder was left with a piece of music that had been built for a context that no longer existed. The brief Elder had received for the Dogworld theme came primarily from Roiland's own reference points. He wanted something that took science fiction seriously at the level of its music, rather than treating the genre as a backdrop for comedy. The specific shows he named as touchstones were Farscape, Doctor Who, and Invader Zim. Each of those properties had a theme with a distinct quality. Farscape's opening music communicated wonder and physical speed simultaneously, built out of synthesized tones that moved between electronic brightness and genuine emotional warmth in a way that felt neither coldly mechanical nor conventionally orchestral. It had a forward momentum that suggested travel and discovery without settling into the triumphalist register of older science fiction themes. Doctor Who occupied a different space. Its theme was built around a melodic hook, simple enough to carry across decades of changing production styles, and mysterious enough to feel genuinely alien without becoming inaccessible. The hook had been reworked numerous times since it was first recorded in the early 1960s, but its core quality, that combination of the memorable and the slightly unsettling, had survived every revision. Invader Zim contributed something sharper and more aggressive, propulsive in a way that foregrounded the show's edge. Elder drew from a wider set of influences beyond those three named references. The film scores of Jerry Goldsmith represented a significant part of his background thinking for the piece. Goldsmith had composed music for some of the most important science fiction films of the 1970s and 1980s, and his approach to the genre had defined a particular vocabulary for how science fiction could sound: serious, detailed, and emotionally engaged with the material rather than simply decorative. Goldsmith treated the science fiction premise as something that deserved the same compositional care he would apply to any other kind of dramatic material, and the scores he produced for properties like Alien and Planet of the Apes reflected that commitment. Elder also cited the general sound of film scoring from that period as influential, a time when the palette available to composers was expanding through new synthesizer technology, while the compositional traditions of Hollywood orchestral scoring were still providing the structural backbone of how themes and underscore were built. The instrumentation Elder assembled for the Dogworld theme reflected both that background and his own synthesizer collection. The Korg Prologue and Microkorg contributed specific textural qualities that sat in the upper mid-range of the frequency spectrum. A Moog Rogue provided a warmer, lower register presence beneath the brighter elements, adding physical weight to the piece without pulling its center of gravity too far down. Two Yamaha instruments, the DX7 and the DX100, were part of the palette as well. The DX7 had a specific sonic quality that became closely associated with electronic music produced during the 1980s. Its frequency modulation synthesis produced clear, bell-like tones with a crystalline brightness that cut through a mix with minimal processing. That clarity was useful for any melodic material that needed to be heard immediately and remembered after a single listen. The combination of those instruments produced something that felt genuinely of its own world, clearly electronic in its construction, clearly referencing a history of synthesized science fiction music, but putting those references together in a way that felt specific rather than generic. Dogworld never moved forward, and the theme Elder had composed for it sat in his archive as a finished piece of music without a home. When Roiland and Harmon were working on the Rick and Morty pilot in 2012, the project needed something to fill the role of of a theme while the actual work of building the show was being done. Harmon had extensive television experience through his years on Community, but animation production had specific technical and creative rhythms that differed from live-action sitcom production, and he was learning those rhythms during the pilot build rather than arriving with them already in place. The pace of production left limited room for music development as a primary focus. Elder, who was already attached to the project in a scoring capacity, put forward the Dogworld theme as something that could occupy the placeholder role without requiring new compositional work before the pilot was finished. The logic was simple. The piece already existed. It had been built to the specifications Roiland had laid out for a science fiction animated series, and it served the immediate practical need. What made the placeholder work was the specific quality of the theme's relationship to tone. Rick and Morty was presenting itself as a show where the comedy came from within a world the show treated as genuinely real, rather than from a winking distance from its own premise. A theme that leaned into the comedy would have set an ironic frame around everything that followed, telling the audience in advance that none of it was meant to be taken seriously. A theme that approached the science fiction premise with genuine cinematic weight did something different. It positioned the comedy as something that existed inside a world that took itself seriously, and that distinction affected how the audience received the dramatic moments embedded within the comedy. When stakes were real in a Rick and Morty episode, the show could make the audience feel them, partly because the opening of each episode had signaled from the first seconds that real stakes were an available register, not a departure from the show's default tone. Nobody replaced the placeholder. By the time the show moved from pilot to series, the theme had already established itself as part of the show's first impression for its growing audience. In television production, the decision-making logic around changing something that is visibly working tends to move in one direction. When a piece of music is contributing to positive reception, altering it risks introducing a disruption for viewers who have already built a connection with it, while the potential upside of a better theme is speculative at best. The Dogworld theme stayed, moving from a temporary holding position to an official and permanent element of the series. It became the opening of more than 80 episodes across 9 seasons, and, through the accumulated exposure of that broadcast run and the enormous audience the show eventually developed, became one of the most recognized pieces of music in adult animation. Elder also carried a credit that sat at an unusual distance from any of the science fiction material the Rick and Morty Association represented. Before the Dogworld composition, before any work on the show, he had written the theme for Wizards of Waverly Place, a Disney Channel series built for a young audience. The two properties sit at opposite ends of almost every available spectrum: tone, content, audience demographics, cultural footprint. Elder moved between them as a matter of professional practice, rather than because they shared obvious thematic common ground. Roiland mentioned the Wizards of Waverly Place work explicitly when discussing how he had come to know Elder, identifying it as an indicator of Elder's range, rather than as a data point that somehow needed to be reconciled with the later science fiction work. Over the course of Rick and Morty's run, the scoring work Elder did beyond the theme expanded considerably in scope and emotional range. Early seasons required music that could pivot between physical comedy and something genuinely affecting within the same episode. Later seasons, as the show developed serialized storylines that gave its characters sustained interior lives across multiple episodes, required Elder to build and sustain emotional registers across longer arcs of story. The ending of the second season in particular placed real weight on the music in a way that tested whether the show's scoring could carry genuine dramatic material without the comedy present to cushion it. What Elder produced for those sequences demonstrated a compositional range that was entirely separate from the adventure register of the opening theme. All of that later work traces back to a piece of music written for a show that never aired. If Cartoon Network had picked up Dogworld in 2006, the theme would have belonged to that series, and the Rick and Morty pilot would have needed something built from the ground up. Whether that something would have worked as well is impossible to know. What the record shows is that the placeholder decision, made quickly under the practical pressures of an accelerated pilot build, turned out to be one of the most consequential choices in the show's creative history. It was not reached through careful deliberation or extended music development. It was reached because a useful piece of music happened to already exist, written for a different purpose, sitting in an archive, and available at exactly the moment it was needed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The theme wasn't the only thing about Rick and Morty that started as an accident. Next up, the most distinctive element of Rick Sanchez's voice came from a mistake in a recording booth in 2006, and nobody ever corrected it. Section 3. The accidental voice recording sessions for the real animated adventures of Doc and Mahardy in 2006 were conducted by Justin Roiland alone in a booth, switching between both characters without a second voice actor present. While recording a line for the scientist character, he burped in the middle of a sentence. Instead of stopping and redoing the take, he kept talking straight through it. That unedited mistake is now one of the most recognized vocal signatures in animated television history. Voice acting convention has a straightforward relationship with unplanned sounds. A burp, a cough, a stumble mid-word, any unintended noise that enters the microphone during a scripted performance is treated as contamination to be cleared and started again. The take is wasted, not because the performance itself was necessarily bad, but because the noise breaks the controlled quality that animation requires. A cartoon character's voice needs to be consistent enough that it can be cut against animation and sound-designed environments without sounding like it was recorded under variable conditions. Directors and engineers hold takes to a high standard of cleanness for exactly that reason, and performers in voice recording booths develop habits that minimize the chances of those problems arising in the first place. Roiland violated that convention instinctively rather than through any deliberate artistic calculation. He heard what had happened to the take and understood in the moment that the contamination had changed something for the better. What the burp added was a quality that is genuinely difficult to produce through conscious technique, the impression that the character existed as a real physical person rather than as a performed voice. A carefully prepared vocal performance communicates preparation. The actor has made choices, thought through how each line should land, calibrated timing and inflection and volume through prior work before the session began. All of that preparation is necessary and usually results in better work than an unprepared performer would produce, but it carries a specific quality that attentive listeners can sometimes detect, a kind of control that signals the presence of craft even when the craft itself is invisible. The Doc and Memhardy, take with the burp in the middle, had no such quality. A person who burps in the middle of a sentence and keeps going, rather than pausing to acknowledge it, is not performing. They are too absorbed in what they are saying to manage their own presentation. The character that quality produced felt inhabited in a way that the cleaner takes around it did not. Roiland would later describe the original burp as accidental when discussing the show's production history in various interviews and public conversations. He was clear that the decision to keep the take came from a real instinct about what it added, rather than from any predetermined plan to build burp talking into the character. Once he recognized what the accident had produced, the question was how to replicate it consistently enough that it could become a defining element of the voice, rather than a one-time occurrence. Inconsistent delivery would have made the burps feel sporadic and arbitrary, which would have undercut their effect. If they appeared randomly without any regularity, they would read as technical errors rather than character traits. For them to work as part of the character's identity, they needed to appear with enough frequency and integration that audiences understood them as belonging to the voice rather than interrupting it. The solution Roiland landed on was direct and physical. He drank beer and water during recording sessions to generate the burps on demand. Both liquids produce carbonation that can be released as burps through modest physical effort, and with practice, it becomes possible to time that release with enough precision to insert a burp at a chosen point in a sentence, rather than simply waiting for one to appear. The practice was not glamorous, and Roiland described it in terms that made clear he was not presenting it as a sophisticated acting technique. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. He needed to produce a specific physical sound at will, and carbonated liquid provided the most reliable mechanism for doing so. The fact that the mechanism was unglamorous was part of why the detail became interesting to audiences when it was shared. Something about the distance between the finished product and the method for achieving it, one of the most distinctive character voices in animation produced partly through controlled drinking in a recording booth, revealed the gap between how creative results appear and how they are actually reached. Beyond the burps, the voice itself required a different set of considerations. Rick Sanchez as a character operates at a specific register of impaired genius that the voice needed to communicate simultaneously. The slurred quality in his speech conveys alcohol's effect on how language is physically produced, the loosening of precise articulation that distinguishes a sober performance from an impaired one. That slur needed to be present consistently without becoming so heavy that it compromised the intelligibility of the dialogue. Rick's lines contain a significant proportion of the show's expository content. He explains what is happening, what the stakes are, what the science underlying any given situation involves, and what needs to be done to resolve it. All of that information has to be received clearly by the audience for the episode's logic to hold together. A slur heavy enough to impede comprehension would undermine the character's functional role in each episode's structure, regardless of how authentic it sounded as a representation of impairment. Roiland calibrated the degree of slurring to stay inside a range where the impairment was audible but the information remained accessible, which required a more precise judgment than the casualness of the performance might suggest. The frenetic quality in the voice, the sense of thought outrunning speech, served a related but distinct purpose. Rick's intelligence is most visibly present not in what he says, but in the speed at which he processes situations. The voice communicates that processing speed directly, suggesting a mind that has already moved several steps beyond the current sentence before the sentence itself is finished. Roiland achieved this by allowing lines to tumble forward without the slight pause between phrases that scripted speech often contains, cutting the natural breathing room from the delivery and letting the momentum of one thought carry directly into the next. The effect is of someone who cannot slow down enough to speak at the pace that normal conversation requires, not because they are frantic or distressed, but because the gap between how fast they think and how fast language moves is simply too large to bridge. The recording process for voicing both Rick and Morty within the same episode created structural demands that had no real precedent in animation. Roiland has described working through a specific sequence within each session. He would record all of Morty's individual lines first, then go back through and record all of the dialogue exchanges between the two characters, and finally record Rick's remaining solo material. That order was not arbitrary. Beginning with Morty established the emotional baseline of each scene. Morty's responses to Rick, his confusion or fear or reluctant compliance, set the temperature of their exchanges in a way that Roiland could then respond to when voicing Rick's side of the same conversation. Recording them in order rather than simultaneously or randomly gave the performances a relational quality, where each character's delivery was informed by what the other character's voice had already laid down, even if the two voices had been produced separately and at different moments within the same session. The challenge deepened in episodes that required numerous distinct versions of either character simultaneously. Season 3's The Ricklantis Mix-Up, which was also broadcast under the title Tales from the Citadel, follows an ensemble of alternate Ricks and Mortys living within the Citadel rather than following the main pair. By the episode's conclusion, Roiland had performed the voices of dozens of distinct characters, each requiring a different inflection or quality to distinguish them from both the primary characters and from each other. A Rick who works as a police officer within the Citadel's social hierarchy reads differently from a Rick running a small food cart at the bottom of that hierarchy, who reads differently again from a Morty navigating a political campaign. The episode functions as a portrait of an entire society built from the same two character templates, and Roiland was responsible for differentiating every member of that society through voice alone. The recording sessions for that single episode represented the most demanding voice performance of his time on the show by a significant margin. Adult Swim had initial concerns when the Rick and Morty pilot was being developed about whether a single actor voicing both lead characters was a workable arrangement. The concern was not primarily about performance quality, it was about character distinctiveness. Morty, in the earliest versions of the material, was less developed as an independent character than Rick. He functioned more as a reactive presence than as someone with his own consistent interior life, and the worry was that two characters voiced by the same person, where one of them lacked strong definition, would blend together in ways that confused the audience's sense of who they were watching. Dan Harmon addressed the concern directly by drafting 4 separate story premises specifically designed to demonstrate Morty as a character with his own perspective and decision-making capacity, someone who pushed back against Rick rather than simply following him. Those 4 premises were sent to Adult Swim as evidence that the character had enough independent definition to justify the casting decision. The network was satisfied and the arrangement moved forward. The improvisational element in Roiland's recording work produced some of the show's most distinctive material. Ricksty Minutes, the 8th episode of the first season, built its entire central premise around improvised content. The fictional interdimensional television programs that Rick and Morty watch on a souped-up cable box were generated almost entirely through Roiland's in-session improvisation rather than through scripted material. He would start a line, let it develop in whatever direction the character logic suggested in the moment, and keep going until the scene found a natural stopping point. Some of those improvisations went places that scripted comedy would not have found, specifically because they were not subject to the revision and refinement that scripts go through. The roughness, the loose ends, the moments where a sketch premise doesn't fully resolve, all of those qualities were preserved in the finished episode rather than smoothed out, and they gave the interdimensional television segments a feel of genuine spontaneity that differentiated them from anything else in adult animation at the time. When Adult Swim cut ties with Roiland in January 2023, following domestic violence charges against him, the show faced a problem that had no direct precedent in modern animation. Both lead characters in a long-running hit series needed to be replaced simultaneously. Previous casting changes in animation had generally involved secondary characters or single leads, not two central characters whose voices had been provided by the same person for a decade. The network's approach was to find performers who could work as close sonic matches rather than attempting to take the characters in a meaningfully different vocal direction. Ian Cardoni took over Rick's voice, and Harry Belden took over Morty's. Season 7 premiered in October 2023, and the critical response addressed the voice transition directly. Most assessments found the new performances close enough that the show's storytelling capacity was not substantially disrupted. The consensus, broadly stated, was that the characters remained recognizable enough for the show to continue functioning as it had. Whether audiences who had spent a decade hearing Roiland's voice would find the transition fully transparent was a more complicated question, but the production's decision to seek sonic continuity rather than a deliberate reimagining of the characters allowed the show to maintain the thread of recognition that had been built across the previous 6 seasons. The 2006 recording session that produced the original burp mid-sentence take did not lead anywhere for years. Roiland kept using the voices in the various Doc and Mehardy shorts that followed, but none of those shorts attracted the kind of attention or institutional support that would have moved the characters toward a television production. They circulated within the Channel 101 community and among people interested in independent internet animation, but they remained peripheral to mainstream animation culture. The voice sat in those shorts, waiting, developing through each new production, without any guarantee that it would ever find a larger context. 7 years passed between the 2006 session and the December 2013 premiere. All of that time, the character existed only in rough festival work and informal parody shorts, fully formed in terms of its vocal qualities, without the framework that would eventually allow those qualities to reach a global audience. episodes. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, one of the most beloved episodes in the show's entire run was built on an idea borrowed from a completely different television series, and the character at the center of it almost didn't exist at all. Section 4, Total Recall and the character nobody planned. Total Recall aired on August 16, 2015, as the fourth episode of Rick and Morty's second season, and the idea that generated the entire episode came from a completely different television show. Writer Mike McMahon walked into the writer's room with a reference to Buffy the Vampire Slayer's fifth season, where the character Dawn Summers appeared without warning, and every character on the show treated her as though she had always existed. McMahon found the device disturbing, rather than merely clever, and that reaction was where the episode started. McMahon's observation was not really about Dawn Summers as a character. It was about what the audience experienced while watching everyone around her behave normally. Buffy the Vampire Slayer had run for 4 complete seasons without any mention of Buffy having a younger sister. Dawn arrived at the opening of season 5, and the show's existing characters accepted her presence without hesitation, recalled shared memories involving her, and expressed ongoing affection as though 4 full seasons of Dawnless storytelling had never occurred. The audience, carrying 4 seasons of clear contradictory evidence in working memory, sat with the dissonance between what they remembered and what the characters were presenting as reality. The show offered no immediate explanation for the contradiction. A supernatural reason for Dawn's existence was eventually provided, but before that explanation arrived, there was a sustained and genuinely unsettling period during which familiar characters behaved in ways that were visibly wrong. McMahon looked at that device and asked what a science fiction version would look like if the mechanism was made explicit rather than left to unfold gradually across a full season arc. Writer Ryan Ridley later described the development process in detail during a podcast appearance, explaining how the room added a second reference point to McMahon's Buffy pitch. John Carpenter's 1982 film The Thing traps a small group of characters in an isolated location while they attempt to determine which of their number is a shape-shifting alien capable of perfectly imitating human beings. The paranoia that generates in the film, where every character is a potential threat and trust between people who have shared genuine history becomes impossible to maintain, gave the episode a structural layer beyond the memory implantation concept. Buffy had provided the idea of false memory insertion. The Thing provided the locked location, the dwindling group of suspects, and the specific anxiety of not being able to trust the evidence of shared experience. The Smith house would serve as the sealed environment, and the parasites would not merely insert themselves physically, but would generate convincing false memories in their hosts to manufacture the impression of deep shared history. Characters who couldn't locate a single genuine negative memory of someone would have no reliable mechanism for separating the real from the manufactured, which gave the episode's central problem a logical framework that held up under examination. Dan Guterman's contribution to the developing episode was the suggestion that the false memory architecture could function as a parody of the clip show format. Clip shows were a cost-saving production mechanism that most long-running television comedies had used at some point across their broadcast runs. An episode built primarily around edited flashbacks to earlier moments, requiring minimal new footage and substantially reduced production resources for that week. Rick and Morty had not been on the air long enough to have a real archive of meaningful moments to draw from, which meant that a clip show parody would need to generate all of its flashback content from scratch. Every false memory the parasites implanted in the Smith family could be a fabricated clip from a show that technically didn't exist, built in whatever direction the writers wanted, entirely unconstrained by the continuity of the episodes that had actually aired. The episode became, structurally, a clip show about a fictional version of Rick and Morty that had never been made. That freedom shaped the range of characters the episode could introduce, since the fake memories had no obligation to feel like they belonged to the actual series the audience had been watching. Among the invented characters generated as parasite-created false memories across Total Recall's runtime, the one that required the most deliberation in production was the one that eventually turned out to be real. Originally, the character occupying the role that Mr. Poopy Butthole ultimately filled was a different concept entirely. McMahon's early draft materials described a character called Bullet Boy, designed as a literal bullet with eyes, arms, and legs drawn onto it in the style of a Saturday morning cartoon prop. Bullet Boy existed to serve the episode's mechanical purpose, a warm, friendly presence whose legitimacy as a genuine family friend would remain uncertain throughout the episode, generating the audience suspicion needed to set up the twist. As a design, Bullet Boy was functional. Nothing about the concept suggested a character interesting enough to develop beyond its single-episode function, or distinctive enough to become a recurring presence that audiences would want to follow. Prior to the Total Recall development process, Roiland had been sketching a character concept in his personal work with a name not suitable for this script: a small yellow figure with a rounded body, a tall oval head, wide eyes, and an open and enthusiastic physical manner. That pre-existing sketch was pulled into the episode as a replacement for Bullet Boy, with the name adjusted to the version that appeared on screen. The design carried a specific quality that Bullet Boy's concept lacked. Where a bullet with cartoon features reads as visually neutral, the rounded yellow figure communicated warmth and vulnerability in a way that made the question of his authenticity authenticity genuinely ambiguous. His appearance did not read as threatening, which was essential for the episode's mechanism to work. A character who looked suspicious would defeat the premise before it could build. Poopy Butthole's visual softness made the idea of him as a beloved longtime family friend plausible at exactly the same time that the episode's logic made plausibility itself the primary indicator of manufactured identity. For the episode's premise to reach its maximum effect, production made a commitment that extended beyond the episode itself. Poopy Butthole was edited directly into the Rick and Morty opening credits sequence for Total Recall, inserted into the existing title animation as though he had appeared in every episode preceding it. That insertion was not flagged or explained anywhere in the episode. It appeared without comment in the credits and sat there, visible to anyone paying close attention. Viewers who noticed it were left to absorb its implications without any guidance from the show about whether it represented a genuine claim about the character's history or something more deliberately unsettling. The episode's central premise was about a character inserting himself into a family's life as though he had always been there. Placing him in the opening credits was the show applying that same logic to its own production, extending the parasite mechanism into the formal apparatus of the series itself rather than confining it to the episode's narrative. Total Recall was not merely telling a story about false memory insertion. At the structural level, the episode was enacting it. Beth shooting Poopy Butthole partway through the episode was the moment the show made its commitment to the premise fully visible. By that point, the audience had accumulated enough suspicion toward every introduced character that the shot felt like a resolution of the episode's central problem. The episode had established clearly that parasites could not generate negative memories in their hosts, that the family's capacity to locate genuine bad experiences with someone was the only available test of that person's legitimacy. The Smith family had no negative memories of Poopy Butthole. That gap in the record pointed directly toward the conclusion Beth reached. What the episode had not prepared the audience for was the blood that followed the shot and the stillness that came after it. Parasites dissolved when killed, releasing the memory implants that had generated them. Poopy Butthole collapsed and bled. The silence in the room recontextualized everything the audience had been watching. He had been real the entire time, and every moment of audience suspicion directed at him had been the episode using the viewer's own pattern recognition against them. Since Poopy Butthole survived his injury and recovered, his status as a genuine entity within the show's world was established beyond any further question within the episode itself. He returned in subsequent episodes and became a recurring presence, particularly in post-credits sequences that followed season finales. In those appearances, he addressed the audience directly about the events of the episode that had just concluded and about what was happening in his own personal life in the time between seasons. He aged visibly between appearances, carrying physical signs of time passing in a way that animated supporting characters almost never do. His domestic circumstances shifted across appearances: rehabilitation following the shooting, a marriage, the complications that followed. His son appeared in a later scene. Those accumulating details treated him as a character experiencing an actual life rather than as a recurring joke waiting to be deployed when the writers needed him. An interpretation offered publicly by Dan Harmon several years after Total Recall aired introduced a reading of Poopy Butthole's nature that the episode itself had deliberately left unresolved. Harmon suggested the possibility that Poopy Butthole might be a variety of parasite that had evolved past the basic memory implantation mechanism, one who had been living with the Smith family long enough that the affection he generated in them had become real rather than manufactured, and that he himself had developed genuine attachment to the family rather than simply simulating it. Harmon acknowledged he was not presenting this as confirmed canon. He offered it as a theory consistent with the character's behavior and the episode's unresolved details, and the fact that the theory fits without contradiction is itself a quality of the episode's construction that rewards the reading. If the pink crystalline growths on the rocks Rick collected at the end of Mortonite Run, the episode that directly preceded Total Recall in broadcast order, were parasite eggs, then Rick introduced the infestation himself by loading those rocks into his vehicle and bringing them home. Mortonite Run ends with Rick placing those rocks in his cargo hold. Total Recall opens with him dumping them from a bag in the kitchen. In Mortonite Run, those rocks carry visible pink spots. In Total Recall's opening, the spots are absent. The absence is consistent with eggs that have already hatched during the interval between episodes. The show placed that continuity detail across 2 consecutive episodes without drawing any attention to it, and left viewers to assemble the implication independently. What it means for Poopy Butthole specifically, whether he arrived with those original eggs or had been present before them, the show declined to answer. Nothing about Total Recall's production history pointed toward the reception it received. McMahon took the premise public in a podcast appearance, later acknowledged as his pitch being the origin of the episode. Ridley confirmed the Buffy and Thing references as the room's working framework. The character at the episode's center replaced a concept called Bullet Boy at a late stage of development. The opening credits were edited to include a character who hadn't appeared before. When the episode aired, critics identified it immediately as one of the strongest hours the show had produced. Assessments of the series in subsequent years have held that position consistently. McMahon went on to create Star Trek Lower Decks, building an entire animated science fiction comedy series of his own. Poopy Butthole became one of the most recognizable supporting characters in Rick and Morty's cast. cast, carrying genuine narrative weight in a show that introduced and discarded characters by the dozen. All of it began with a writer finding Buffy's sister disturbing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, a single throwaway line of dialogue from a Season 3 episode pulled a discontinued McDonald's dipping sauce from 1998 back into national conversation, and what followed was unlike anything a cartoon had triggered before. Section 5. The sauce that broke McDonald's. McDonald's introduced its Szechuan teriyaki dipping sauce in June 1998 as a promotional tie-in for the Disney animated film Mulan. The sauce was available for a limited run alongside Chicken McNuggets and Happy Meals, packaged with a set of 8 Mulan-themed toys, and pulled from every restaurant location once the film's promotional window closed. Nobody at McDonald's expected to think about it again. 19 years later, a single line of animated dialogue turned it into a national event. The Mulan promotion had operated inside the normal commercial logic of studio-restaurant partnerships. Disney maintained a strategic relationship with McDonald's during the late 1990s that focused specifically on Happy Meals as a vehicle for reaching young audiences during a film's theatrical run. When Mulan was approaching its June 1998 release, the partnership produced the standard package, themed toys distributed across the meal, promotional materials in restaurants, and a limited availability condiment designed to evoke the film's Chinese setting. McDonald's chief marketing officer at the time described the brief sent to the company's food vendors as a request for something Asian-themed, compatible with Chicken McNuggets, and positioned toward Chinese flavor profiles. The vendor that won the commission produced a hoisin-influenced sauce with sesame oil notes and a faint sweetness that the internal team found appropriate to the brief. The name Szechuan was chosen through a standard naming process and attached to the sauce primarily because it communicated Chinese culinary identity to American consumers in 1998, rather than because the sauce bore any specific relationship to actual Szechuan cooking traditions. Actual Szechuan pepper was in fact banned from import to the United States during that period due to agricultural regulations and wouldn't become available again until 2005, meaning the sauce was built entirely without its namesake ingredient. The product fulfilled its promotional purpose, disappeared from menus when the film's promotional cycle ended, and entered the long archive of discontinued fast food items that generate occasional nostalgia online but rarely attract sustained attention. Season 3 of Rick and Morty had been a prolonged absence from the audience's perspective. The second season had ended in October 2015 with a cliffhanger that left the Smith family's situation fundamentally altered, and the gap before new episodes arrived stretched far beyond what the show's release pattern had previously suggested. When the third season premiere finally aired in April 2017, its cold open placed Rick inside a simulated memory sequence where he ordered food from a 1998 McDonald's. He requested the Szechuan dipping sauce. Later in the episode, after dismantling the Galactic Federation and restructuring his family's domestic situation entirely, Rick delivered a monologue to Morty, explaining his true motivations. He stated clearly that none of what had happened was about family or revenge or any larger purpose. His series arc, he announced, was about recovering that McNugget sauce. He planned to pursue it across however many seasons the show required, or across 97 more years if that was what it took. The writing staff has described the line as a throwaway joke rather than a considered narrative commitment. Rick was not going to spend 9 seasons pursuing a discontinued dipping sauce. The reference was built on the specific quality of the character's nihilism, the idea that Rick Sanchez, who genuinely could pursue any goal across any dimension of the multiverse, had chosen to fixate on something as trivial and unrecoverable as a fast food condiment from 1998. The humor came from the gap between his actual capabilities and the smallness of what he claimed to want, and the line was constructed to land quickly and move on. What the writing staff did not calculate was how many viewers watching in April 2017 had been children in 1998, had eaten McDonald's Mulan Happy Meals, and had a dormant memory of the sauce that the line activated in a very specific way. By the morning after the premiere, the sauce reference had spread across social media at a pace that the production team had not anticipated. Searches for the discontinued product spiked sharply. Viewers who had not thought about the Mulan promotion in nearly 2 decades found themselves with a clear memory of the sauce and a specific desire to taste it again, a desire that had not existed 24 hours earlier. The mechanics of nostalgia had been activated not by a sustained campaign or a deliberate marketing strategy, but by a single joke in an animated episode, and the activation happened across a large enough audience simultaneously that the collective response became visible as a cultural event rather than scattered individual reactions. A corporate chef at McDonald's named Mike Horrocks monitored the conversation developing online and recognized an opportunity that the company could either engage with or ignore. Horrocks occupied a position inside McDonald's food development infrastructure that gave him the actual capacity to act on what he was seeing. He had access to test kitchen resources and the internal knowledge needed to reconstruct a recipe that the company had not produced in 19 years. The decision to send a physical quantity of the sauce directly to Justin Roiland was made within the framework of the company extending a joke rather than committing to a commercial strategy. McDonald's test kitchen produced 4 containers of the reconstructed sauce. 3 were sent to fans. The 4th went to Roiland. The letter accompanied accompanying the shipment, explained the sauce's origins in a manner consistent with the show's own fictional logic, citing a dimension where it was perpetually 1998 as the source of the supply. The company had not merely acknowledged the reference, it had constructed its response in the specific language of the show's universe. Roiland mentioned the incoming sauce at San Diego Comic-Con in July 2017, confirming that McDonald's had sent him a container before he had actually received it. The announcement accelerated a conversation that was already moving quickly. Fans who had been discussing the sauce since the April premiere now had confirmation that the company was paying active attention, and that awareness shifted the conversation toward the possibility of an actual commercial return. Petitions appeared across multiple platforms requesting a limited run. A packet of original 1998 Szechuan sauce that a consumer discovered inside a used car they had purchased appeared on the secondary market and sold on an auction platform for approximately $14,700, a figure that would have been functionally incomprehensible applied to any other 19-year-old fast food condiment. The price reflected not the sauce itself, but the specific cultural moment the sauce had come to represent, a meeting point between the show's enormous fan base and the specific register of food nostalgia that the episode had triggered. McDonald's announced a limited return of the Szechuan sauce in October 2017. The commercial logic appeared straightforward. The demand signal had been clear and sustained enough across multiple months to justify a promotional run. The company produced quantities it judged appropriate to the anticipated response and distributed the sauce to restaurant locations across the United States for a single day on October 7, 2017. The quantities available at most locations were dramatically insufficient for the crowds that arrived. Restaurants that had received small supplies, sometimes described as only a few dozen packets, faced lines that numbered in the hundreds. When locations ran out, the scenes that followed had a character that nobody at McDonald's had planned for. Some locations attempted to manage the situation by distributing rain checks. Others faced customers who had waited for hours and responded to the depletion with significant displeasure. Videos of overwhelmed restaurant lobbies circulated online the same day and attracted coverage from media outlets that did not typically spend extended time on fast food promotions. The episode that followed the October chaos was an internal assessment at McDonald's of what had actually happened. The demand for the sauce had been real, sustained, and specific enough to warrant a full commercial rollout, but the October event had misread the scale of that demand by a considerable margin. The company announced a broader return of the sauce for February 2018, producing quantities that reflected a more accurate reading of how many people actually wanted it. That second release was managed with more preparation and reached consumers without the scenes that had accompanied the October version. The sauce was available, people who wanted it could get it, and the moment concluded without incident. The cultural intensity that had surrounded the first return dissipated once the scarcity that had been driving it was resolved. A 1998 McDonald's promotional condiment had become, briefly, one of the most discussed consumer food products in the country. The mechanism behind that outcome was a single animated episode and the specific quality of collective nostalgia that the internet had made available as a force in commercial culture. Prior to social media's development as a genuine mass communications infrastructure, scattered individuals who remembered the Mulan sauce would have had no practical way to find each other, aggregate their interest, or make that interest visible to McDonald's in any form the company could act on. The conditions that turned a throwaway animated joke into a documented commercial event did not exist in 1998 when the sauce first appeared. They were built in the years between that first appearance and the episode that recalled it, and Rick and Morty happened to activate them in a particularly concentrated way. Dan Harmon and the writing staff were watching the fallout with a mixture of amusement and something approaching disbelief. The line had been written as a character moment, an illustration of Rick's capacity to invest genuine conviction in completely trivial goals. Its function in the episode was to demonstrate that the character's worldview was specifically oriented away from meaningful motivations and towards small, replaceable, and ultimately pointless ones. The Szechuan sauce was funny as a target for Rick's obsession precisely because it was so inadequate as a goal. A line built to communicate the smallness of what a god-level intellect had decided mattered had generated, in the real world, $14,000 eBay auctions and overwhelmed McDonald's lobbies. The distance between what the joke meant inside the episode and what it produced outside of it illustrated something about the relationship between Rick and Morty and its audience that wasn't fully visible from inside the production. McDonald's official social media presence responded to the episode's premiere by posting a phrase combining the show's catchphrase with a McNuggets reference, signaling an awareness of the joke almost immediately after the episode aired. That speed reflected how thoroughly the company monitored the cultural conversation around its products and how quickly its communications teams could respond when that conversation moved in a direction worth engaging with. The response landed awkwardly for many viewers who found corporate participation in fan language uncomfortable, but the underlying commercial awareness it demonstrated was accurate. Rick and Morty had given McDonald's an opportunity it would have been difficult to generate through any conventional marketing approach, and the company recognized the opportunity quickly enough to act on it across several phases over the following year. Among all the specific products, catchphrases, and cultural moments the show produced across its run, the Szechuan sauce episode remains the clearest example of an animated series generating a real real-world commercial event through the specific mechanism of collective nostalgia directed at a target that still existed as a corporate institution with the capacity to respond. The sauce has no meaningful connection to the show's actual themes, its science fiction premise, its character dynamics, or any of the creative qualities that generated the audience in the first place. Rick wanted it because Rick wanting something trivial with absolute conviction was funny. The rest of what happened had almost nothing to do with the episode and almost everything to do with what kind of audience had built up around the show in the 4 years between its premiere and that April 2017 night. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, in April 2017, Rick and Morty Season 3 arrived with no announcement, no marketing, and no warning. And it happened on the one day of the year when nobody could tell if it was real. Section 6. The best April Fool's prank in television history. At 8 p.m. Eastern on April 1st, 2017, Adult Swim replaced its scheduled programming with the Season 3 premiere of Rick and Morty and told nobody. The episode had not been announced, promoted, or listed anywhere in the network's broadcast schedule. Season 2 had ended in October 2015, 17 months earlier, and the audience had been given no confirmed timeline for when new material would arrive. The premiere ran on a loop until midnight without interruption, and by morning, it had become one of the most discussed television events of that year. The gap between Seasons 2 and 3 had developed its own specific character as it extended beyond what the audience had been led to expect. Dan Harmon had given interviews during the early months of 2016, suggesting the new season would arrive before the end of that year. That timeline slipped without formal announcement, and the extended wait accumulated into a running cultural joke shared between the show's creators and its audience. Adult Swim published a press release in January 2017, announcing the launch of a promotional website for the show. The release concluded with a direct acknowledgement of the question everyone was asking, noting plainly that, no, there was no premiere date yet. The tone was deliberate. The network understood the frustration surrounding the delay and chose to acknowledge it openly rather than deflect with vague assurances of quality. That candor had earned some goodwill, but the audience's patience had limits. By April 2017, Rick and Morty had been absent from television for a year and a half, and the conversation around when it was coming back had become a persistent background frequency in the online communities built around the show. The idea for the unannounced premiere came from Mike Lazo, a senior executive at Adult Swim, whose connection to the network went back to its earliest programming. Lazo had been involved with Adult Swim since the period when the late-night programming block was being built from scratch on top of Cartoon Network's existing broadcast structure, and his sensibility as a creative executive had shaped much of what the network had become in the intervening years. His tenure at the network extended back to Space Ghost Coast to Coast, a show widely considered the origin point of the Adult Swim aesthetic, a property built from repurposed existing animation, stripped of its original context, and rebuilt around a sensibility too strange and self-aware for any conventional broadcast home. That lineage gave Lazo a specific understanding of what the Adult Swim audience responded to, built through more than 2 decades of direct observation, rather than through market research or demographic modeling. His instinct for what surprised that audience versus what they anticipated was not theoretical. It was practical knowledge accumulated across the entire history of the programming block he had helped build. His instinct for what the Adult Swim audience responded to was developed through long familiarity with how that audience thought and what surprised them versus what they anticipated. The April Fool's premiere was the kind of idea that required genuine institutional confidence to execute. It meant withholding the Season 3 premiere of the network's most popular show from any conventional marketing infrastructure, and trusting that the surprise itself would generate more impact than any campaign could. Roiland's initial reaction to the idea, which he described in an interview with GameSpot several months after the event, was that it was completely crazy and probably wrong. His objection was practical. Season 3 was arriving after an extended absence, during which the show's audience had grown significantly beyond its original size. New viewers who had discovered the series during the gap between seasons might have no idea the premiere was happening, and burning the season's first episode in a stunt format rather than in a conventional premiere slot seemed like a waste of a significant moment. Traditional television logic held that a long-awaited season return was a marketing opportunity to be maximized, not a piece of content to be dropped without warning on a night most people would be skeptical of anything they saw online. The standard approach would have involved a confirmed date weeks in advance, promotional clips, interviews, and all the apparatus that surrounds a major animated series returning after a long hiatus. Lazo's argument, as Roiland later described it, had the specific quality of ideas that seem wrong immediately but become obviously right after the fact. The gap between seasons had itself become part of the show's identity. The audience's frustration with the delay was genuine, and that frustration had a specific flavor. It was the frustration of people who cared enough about something to be annoyed by its absence, which meant it was also the frustration of people who would respond with enormous energy the moment that absence ended. Channeling that energy into the surprise of an unannounced premiere, rather than into the managed anticipation of a conventional rollout, produced a different kind of event. A conventional premiere would have been celebrated. What happened on April 1st, 2017 was experienced. The technical execution of the stunt was straightforward by broadcast standards. The scheduled Adult Swim programming for the evening was pulled, the Rick Redemption was loaded to air in its place, and the episode ran on a loop from 8 p.m. until midnight, repeating every half hour. Adult Swim's website simultaneously streamed the episode with a label that said April Fools, which was accurate in one sense and entirely misleading in the intended one. The label suggested the stream itself was the prank rather than the genuine premiere of the season. Some viewers encountered the episode on television, where no such disclaimer existed. Others found the stream online and spent the first several minutes uncertain whether they were watching an actual new episode or an elaborate fake constructed to look like one. The uncertainty was part of the experience. By the time the episode's first major plot developments made clear that real story material was being presented, the conversation had already spread far enough that the premiere's authenticity was no longer in question. The announcement mechanism Adult Swim used was a single post on the official Rick and Morty social media account, stating that a new episode was airing at that moment and providing a link to the stream. That post went up after the episode had already begun, which meant the discovery sequence for most viewers ran in reverse from how marketing normally operated. Rather than awareness building in advance of content becoming available, the content was already playing when awareness began to spread. People who saw the post and clicked through found themselves mid-episode rather than at the beginning, and many described going back to watch from the start after confirming the episode was real. The social media post itself became a piece of the event's texture, a statement so understated relative to what it was announcing that it read initially as the prank rather than as the genuine news. The episode preempted two shows whose audiences had their own dedicated followings. Samurai Jack was in the middle of its long-awaited final season on Adult Swim, returning after a 14-year absence from television, and its scheduled premiere that evening was pushed back. Dragon Ball Super, which had been building its own consistent viewership in the Adult Swim programming block, was also displaced. Fans of those shows expressed frustration on the same social platforms where Rick and Morty fans were expressing something close to collective disbelief. The convergence of those reactions made the evening's events difficult to miss online, regardless of which show any particular viewer had been following. The Rick Redemption picked up directly from the second season finale's cliffhanger. Rick was imprisoned by the Galactic Federation. Earth had been absorbed into a Federation-controlled system. The Smith family was navigating a fundamentally altered domestic situation without Rick present. The episode resolved those circumstances in ways that were unexpected even by the standards of what the show had demonstrated it was willing to do. Several established elements of the show's world were dismantled or restructured during the episode's runtime. Jerry's relationship with the family reached a formal conclusion that changed the Smith household's composition permanently, or at least until a later season reversed it. Rick's apparent motivation for everything that had happened, which the episode revealed through a memory sequence, was a discontinued condiment from 1998. The episode landed at precisely the right density of consequence and absurdity to remind a 17-month absent audience of what the show could do that nothing else on television was attempting. The viewing numbers for the initial 8 p.m. airing were modest. Approximately 676,000 households tuned in during that first broadcast, a figure that reflected how few people had any advance knowledge the episode was happening. As the loop continued and the online conversation spread, the numbers for subsequent airings within the same evening grew considerably. By the third and fourth loop of the episode before midnight, the household count had climbed substantially from that opening figure, as people who had seen the conversation online tuned in mid-loop to see what was actually happening. The cumulative viewing total across all four airings that evening, combined with the stream numbers from the Adult Swim website running simultaneously, represented a meaningfully larger audience than the initial 8 p.m. figure suggested in isolation. The digital stream in particular performed at a level that reflected how the show's audience consumed content. Rick and Morty viewers were not primarily passive cable subscribers waiting for a scheduled broadcast. They were active online participants who encountered the episode through social media, navigated to wherever it was available, and watched it on whatever screen was in front of them at that moment. The April Fool's format had accidentally suited that consumption pattern almost perfectly, releasing the episode into the social media environment where its audience already lived, rather than behind a broadcast schedule that required advance awareness to find. The following day, the episode was available through Adult Swim's digital platforms, and the conversation that had been building since the previous evening continued to drive viewers toward it. The full Season 3 audience, which extended across the remaining 9 episodes that aired from July 30th through October 1st, became the largest audience Rick and Morty had attracted across its broadcast run to that point. The 4-month gap between the April premiere and the July start of the remaining episodes was itself a production consequence rather than a creative choice. The season had originally been conceived as 14 episodes, consistent with the first season's 11, and a gesture toward a longer run than the second season's 10. During production, that count was reduced to 10. The reasons behind that reduction have not been documented in complete detail, but the production demands of Rick and Morty relative to its episode count were well established by that point. Each episode required writing development through Dan Harmon's structured story process, full animation production at the Canadian studio Bardell Entertainment, and extensive voice recording work that that included Roiland performing both lead characters. A season that had been in development during a period of significant external difficulty for at least one of its creators was not going to arrive on the schedule that had originally seemed realistic. Harmon had been open in various contexts about the personal difficulties surrounding the third season's production. His divorce from his wife, who was also a collaborator on various projects, occurred during the production period, and the emotional weight of that experience shaped elements of the season's content in ways that Harmon later described in interviews. Beth and Jerry's separation, which ran through season 3 as a sustained narrative thread rather than resolving quickly, reflected preoccupations that were present in the writing room's atmosphere during that period. The season that resulted from all of those circumstances, personal and professional, was received as the show's most emotionally demanding work to that point. Critics who assessed the full season after its October conclusion identified a consistency of ambition across the 10 episodes that exceeded what the previous 2 seasons had achieved. The April Fool's stunt's legacy within Adult Swim's programming history was immediate and durable. The network had been running April 1st pranks for years before 2017, some of them involving voice swaps or scheduling inversions or unexpected guest-produced content. The Rick and Morty premiere operated at a different scale from any of those previous stunts because what was dropped was not a parody or an experiment, but the actual first episode of the most anticipated season of the network's most popular show. The audience response demonstrated that the format could be used to deliver genuine content rather than only to subvert expectations around content. Whether Adult Swim has since achieved a comparable moment through the same approach is a reasonable question. The specific conditions that made April 1, 2017 work as it did were not fully reproducible: a season return after 17 months, an audience primed by extended frustration, and a show at exactly the right point in its cultural trajectory to generate the kind of social media cascade that turned the event from a television broadcast into a shared collective experience. Roiland's retrospective assessment of the stunt, delivered months after the event from a position where its success was fully visible, was that Lazo had been right and his own initial skepticism had been wrong. The language he used to describe that reversal was specific about what Lazo's instinct had correctly identified. The gap between seasons had built up a pressure in the audience that a conventional premiere would have released in a predictable way, while the surprise had released the same pressure in a way that nobody anticipated and therefore nobody could plan around. The lack of planning was the mechanism. An event that everyone is prepared for generates the response that preparation produces. What happened on April 1, 2017 generated something that preparation couldn't have produced because the specific quality of collective surprise has no planned equivalent. The season 3 finale aired on October 1st, 2017, and Adult Swim announced that the finale had delivered the highest ratings in the network's history. That number encompassed everything Adult Swim had broadcast across its entire existence as a programming block. Rick and Morty had become the flagship of a network that had spent over a decade building one of the most distinctive brand identities in American cable television, and the season whose premiere nobody had been told about had delivered the largest audience in that network's history. 7 months after an executive decided to drop the episode with no warning on a night dedicated to pranks, the season concluded with a number that made clear the gamble had been correct in every dimension it was possible to measure. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, before season 3 arrived on television, the show made history on a completely different platform, releasing an entire episode through a method nobody had used for a television premiere before. Section 7, 109 clips. Rick's Minutes, the 8th episode of Rick and Morty's first season, aired on Adult Swim on March 17, 2014. 4 days before that broadcast, the entire episode had already been released to the public, cut into 109 separate clips of 15 seconds each, and posted sequentially to the show's official Instagram account. No television series had ever premiered an episode that way before. The clips sat on the platform across the days leading up to the broadcast, available to anyone willing to watch them in fragments, or patient enough to wait for fans online to assemble them into something continuous. The decision to use Instagram as a pre-release platform reflected a specific moment in how Adult Swim understood its audience's relationship with social media. By early 2014, Instagram had been a major platform for approximately 2 years, having launched in October 2010 and grown rapidly enough that it was acquired by Facebook in April 2012 for approximately $1 billion. The platform's architecture in that period was built almost entirely around images rather than video, with a 15-second video feature added only in June 2013, roughly 9 months before the Rick Minutes release. That video feature was new enough in early 2014 that most brands and media companies were still working out what to do with it. Adult Swim's decision to use it as a distribution mechanism for an entire television episode was not drawn from an existing playbook. There was no existing playbook. The network was doing something genuinely new with infrastructure that had only recently become available, and the choice to apply it to the Rick and Morty premiere specifically reflected both the show's young and digitally native audience and an understanding that the episode's unusual format made it better suited than most for that kind of fragmented distribution. Rick Minutes is structurally unlike almost every other episode the show produced across its run. Dan Harmon's commitment to the 8-step story circle he had developed and refined across his years writing Community was well established by the time Rick and Morty was in production, and the framework shaped nearly every episode's underlying architecture, even when the surface content was at its most chaotic. A standard Rick and Morty episode begins with a character in a familiar situation, introduces a need or a disruption, propels that character into an unfamiliar environment, builds through a series of escalating complications toward a discovery, extracts a cost for that discovery, returns the character to something resembling the starting point, and lands them changed by whatever they passed through. That shape was flexible enough to accommodate enormous variety in content while providing the emotional coherence that allowed each episode to feel satisfying rather than arbitrary at its conclusion. Rick's Minutes abandoned the shape almost entirely. Harmon was known to have a specific and personal investment in story structure as the mechanism that distinguished meaningful narrative from random content generation. An episode with almost no conventional plot, produced by a creator with that relationship to structure, was inherently unusual. The premise set up the absence of plot as its central condition, rather than as a flaw to be corrected. Rick, frustrated by the quality of available television, rewired the family's cable box to receive programming from every possible dimension simultaneously. From that point forward, Rick and Morty spent most of the episodes sitting on the couch watching interdimensional television, while the rest of the family used a separate device Rick provided to observe alternate universe versions of themselves. The two storylines ran in parallel with minimal intersection. The interdimensional television content had no narrative arc because interdimensional television content has no narrative arc. Programs appeared, ran briefly, and were replaced by other programs with no connective tissue between them. A show about a dimension where humanity evolved from corn. A detective series whose lead character appeared to be made entirely of sentient snakes. A game show format that could not be described accurately without sounding like it had been invented by someone under considerable stress. The content multiplied without accumulation, which meant the episode could not build in the way that a conventional Rick and Morty episode built, and Harmon knew that when the decision to make it was made. Justin Roiland generated the interdimensional television content almost entirely through improvisation during recording sessions, rather than through scripted material. The television programs Rick and Morty flipped through were not written in advance. Roiland began recording with a general sense of what kind of show was being parodied or invented for each segment, and developed the specific content in the moment, following the character logic wherever it moved without the safety net of a script to return to if the improvisation stalled. Some of the segments ran comfortably to natural conclusions. Others ran into walls or started laughing at themselves, which Roiland left in the recording rather than cutting before the momentum collapsed. The segment called Two Brothers begins confidently and gradually loses its own thread as the premise runs out of steam, and Roiland's audible amusement at its disintegration became part of the finished audio. Gazarpazarpfield, a parody of the Garfield comic strip transplanted into the show's universe, contains a moment near its end where Roiland begins to laugh during the recording, and the laugh sits in the final cut. Other voice actors brought in to perform additional characters within those segments were instructed to match Roiland's delivery beat for beat, rather than bring their own interpretation, preserving the improvisational texture even through performances that were technically prepared. The episode's emotional weight arrived entirely through the Jerry, Beth, and Summer storyline, rather than through anything happening on the couch. Using the interdimensional goggles Rick had given them, the three observed versions of themselves from timelines where Jerry had not married Beth. In the primary alternate timeline available to them, Jerry had become a celebrated actor. Beth had become a surgeon operating without the domestic constraints that had shaped her professional choices in the main timeline. Summer, in that alternative, did not exist. Her parents' separation had prevented the circumstances that led to her birth. Summer sat with that information and could not process it into anything comfortable. The episode allowed that discomfort to sit for an unusually long time before providing any response to it. Morty's response, when it arrived, was delivered quietly and without the framing that a more conventionally structured episode would have provided. He explained to Summer that he and Rick had traveled through the multiverse and had seen enough alternate timelines to understand that the specific version of events that produced their existence was one outcome among infinite others, none of which was more real or more deserved than any other. He told her something close to this, that nobody who exists belongs here, any more than anyone who doesn't, that existence was not earned and could not be justified through any available logic, and that sitting with that information was not a problem to solve but a condition to accept. The speech ran for less than 2 minutes of screen time and landed with an emotional precision that the episode's surrounding absurdity had not obviously been building toward. It was the kind of moment that recontextualizes everything around it when it arrives, making the comedy that preceded it feel like a specific kind of preparation rather than random noise. Assembling all 109 Instagram clips into a watchable, continuous episode required effort. Adult Swim had not provided any mechanism for viewing them sequentially on the platform. Each clip was a standalone post, captioned and uploaded individually, without the playlist infrastructure that streaming platforms later made standard. Viewers who discovered the clips early and wanted to watch the episode before its broadcast air date had two options: scroll through the account and watch each clip separately with the interruptions between them, or find their way to fan-assembled pre-assembled compilations that people online had already begun to construct by downloading each clip and editing them together. The fan assembly work happened quickly. Before the broadcast date arrived, multiple complete versions of the episode built from the Instagram clips were circulating through the online communities built around the show. Some viewers who watched the episode through those assemblies described the experience as uniquely strange. A television episode watched through a chain of 15-second videos, each carrying Instagram's visual framing, dissolving and reassembling, with each clip transition into something that was technically complete but experientially fragmented in a way that no broadcast version could replicate. The broadcast version aired on March 17, 2014 to approximately 148 million viewers, a figure consistent with the first season's general performance rather than representing a spike driven by the Instagram release. The pre-release had not significantly damaged the broadcast audience, which was the practical question any network would ask about a distribution experiment of that kind. Viewers who had assembled the clips and watched the episode early came back for the broadcast regardless, partly because the broadcast quality was better than what the platform's video compression had provided, and partly because the social dimension of watching a new episode at the moment it aired was its own distinct experience that the Instagram clips had not replaced. The two modes of viewing had been additive rather than competitive. The specific quality of the interdimensional television format as a recurring device across Rick and Morty's early seasons owed something to a very different animated property. The fourth episode of House of Cosby's, Roiland's Channel 101 series that had been shut down by cease and desist action in 2005, involved a sequence where characters watched alien television programming together. That format, a group of characters sitting together observing increasingly strange broadcast content from outside their normal experience, had been available in Roiland's creative vocabulary since his earliest work. The interdimensional cable format built something considerably more expansive from that seed, using the infinite multiverse premise as a logical justification for an infinite range of television content. But the structural idea of comedy, generated through observed media from other cultures or dimensions, had appeared in Roiland's work years before Rick and Morty existed. The episode's improvised content created a specific continuity challenge for the show's later seasons. 60 Minutes was followed in Season 2 by Interdimensional Cable 2, Tempting Fate, which extended the format across a second episode. Fans of both episodes have identified the improvised segments as among the most distinctive and memorable material in either season, partly because improvisation produces surprises that scripted content structurally cannot. A scripted joke requires a writer to know the punchline before writing the setup. An improvised segment can surprise the performer and the audience simultaneously. That quality was audible in the recordings and visible in the final animation. The segments that worked best did so because they found their punchlines in the moment rather than building toward them from outside. Roiland later described a third interdimensional cable episode as having been considered for Season 3 before the production decision was made to replace the format with a different anthology structure. Season 3's Morty's Mind Blowers used a vault of suppressed memories as its organizing framework instead, which produced an episode with stronger emotional continuity than the cable format had allowed, but without the specific improvisational texture that had made the earlier cable episodes distinctive. The Instagram premiere's historical position as the first television episode released through that platform has never been claimed by anything else. No other show had done it before, and the specific conditions that made it interesting in March 2014, a newly available 15-second video feature on a platform whose audience overlapped almost exactly with Rick and Morty's viewership, were not permanent conditions. The platform changed substantially in the years that followed, adding longer video formats, story features, and eventually an entire separate video infrastructure that made the 15-second clip approach look rudimentary by comparison. What Adult Swim did with those 109 clips in the days before March 17, 2014, was built entirely from what was available at that specific moment, and the moment did not last long enough for the approach to become repeatable in exactly the same form. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, the episode that made Rick and Morty a household name with awards voters was written as a parody of a Breaking Bad episode, and the woman who wrote it had been waiting years for the right moment to pitch it. Section 8. The Pickle That Won an Emmy Pickle. Rick aired on August 6, 2017, as the third episode of Rick and Morty's third season, written by Jessica Gao and directed by Anthony Chun. The premise was precise and completely absurd. Rick Sanchez turned himself into a pickle to avoid attending a family therapy session. The episode received the 2018 Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program, becoming the first Emmy the show had ever won. Gao had been carrying the core idea for years before the right moment arrived to pitch it. Gao joined the Rick and Morty writing staff during the third season and arrived with a specific creative sensibility built from years working in television comedy. The pickle concept had existed in her thinking before she was on the show, an image rather than a fully developed story. A scientist who had turned himself into a pickle for reasons that were simultaneously brilliant and completely self-defeating. The gap between Rick's limitless capability and his capacity to apply that capability toward the smallest possible act of avoidance was the heart of what made the image funny. A man who could navigate the multiverse, dismantle galactic governments, and build functional technology from dead rats and sewer detritus chose to turn himself into a vegetable to skip a therapy appointment. The comedy story and the character insight were the same thing, which gave the premise unusual structural efficiency. Gao held on to it, waiting for a season that would support the specific kind of emotional content the episode would need alongside its action material. The third season's overarching preoccupation with the Smith family's domestic fracture gave Gao the context the idea required. Beth and Jerry's separation ran as a sustained thread through season 3, rather than resolving quickly, and the family dynamics that resulted from that separation created space for an episode that could address the underlying relationship between Rick and Beth through the mechanism of a shared therapy session. Dr. Wong, the therapist Beth had scheduled for the family, needed to be a character strong enough to hold the episode's emotional center against both the physical comedy of Rick's pickle predicament and the action sequence his situation generated. She could not be a device for delivering psychological information about Rick in a detached way. She needed to be someone Rick genuinely could not dismiss, whose observations carried enough weight that he was forced to sit with them rather than deflect them into absurdity. The casting of Susan Sarandon addressed that requirement directly. Sarandon brought an authority to the role that made the therapy scenes land with genuine force, rather than functioning merely as counterpoint to the pickle material. The Breaking Bad reference point that shaped the episode's action structure came from a season 2 episode of that series called 4 Days Out, in which Walter White and Jesse Pinkman are stranded in the desert with a dying RV and must apply chemistry knowledge to survive using only what is available in their immediate environment. The episode's specific quality came from watching a character with genuine technical expertise improvise solutions to escalating physical problems from extremely limited resources, building each solution from what the previous one had produced rather than from any external help. Gao identified that structure as the right framework for the sequence in which Rick, having been knocked off his lab bench and washed into the sewer, needed to construct a functional exoskeleton from the bodies of dead animals while being a pickle with no usable limbs. The logical chain of improvised solutions, where each problem generated a tool that addressed the next problem, was directly drawn from what made the Breaking Bad episode work. A pickle navigating a sewer rat kill and building a cockroach-powered arm from scratch required exactly that kind of escalating improvised problem-solving to hold together under examination. The action sequence that followed Rick's sewer survival placed him inside a heavily fortified building where he worked through an increasingly dangerous set of opponents, building on his exoskeleton with each encounter and using the creativity of his solutions to demonstrate capability despite his pickle form. Danny Trejo voiced Jaguar, an assassin whose function in the episode was to provide a physical match for Pickle Rick while also carrying a character dimension that the episode revealed in a post-credits scene. Trejo had built a specific cultural identity around his physical presence in action films, and casting him as a character whose formidability was entirely vocal rather than physical placed his voice in dialogue with what audiences already associated with him. The post-credits scene, in which Jaguar saves Rick and Morty from a villain called Concerto, ended with Rick delivering a line to Morty, noting that this outcome was exactly why therapy was a bad idea. The line inverted the episode's emotional argument at the last possible moment, which was consistent with the character refusing to acknowledge what the therapy scene had revealed about him, but inconsistent with any reading of the episode that suggested Rick actually believed that. Dr. Wong's assessment of Rick during the therapy session represented some of the most direct psychological writing the show had produced about the character to that point. She observed that Rick's intelligence had allowed him to build a framework in which his own avoidance of difficulty was reframed as superiority, in which running from vulnerability was coded as transcending the concerns of lesser people rather than recognized as fear. She connected that framework to the family dynamics visible in the session, noting that Beth had absorbed a version of the same logic and was applying it in her own life in ways that were producing recognizable damage. The specificity of Wong's observations was unusual for a secondary character introduced in a single episode, and the fact that Rick had no effective verbal counter to them, that his response was silence rather than deconstruction, was the most significant character moment the episode produced. Rick could dismantle most arguments put to him. Wong's observations did not give him a surface to push against, and the episode held that silence long enough for the audience to feel its weight. The Emmy category Rick and Morty competed in for the 2018 Creative Arts Emmys had historically been dominated by the same group of long-running animated series. The 5 nominees for Outstanding Animated Program that year were Rick and Morty, Bob's Burgers, The Simpsons, Family Guy, and Big Hero 6 the series. Across the previous several years, the category had rotated wins among The Simpsons and South Park, with occasional wins for other properties, but the combined institutional presence of those long-running network shows had shaped the category's general expectations. Rick and Morty had not been nominated before. The Pickle Rick win, announced at the ceremony on September 8, 2018, represented the show's first competitive recognition from the Television Academy and the first time in the category's recent history that the winner had come from Adult Swim rather than from network television. A notable additional detail about that year's nominees was that all 5 were produced through 2-dimensional animation rather than through the computer-generated techniques that had become standard for theatrical animation. The category's field that year was entirely hand-drawn and traditionally animated, which produced a different visual quality across all the nominated episodes than a mixed field would have. Roiland's response to the win was delivered on social media and carried the specific register of someone who found the recognition genuinely surprising. He noted publicly that the show had effectively become mainstream through the award, using language that framed the Emmy as a departure from the outsider identity the show had cultivated, rather than as a confirmation of established quality. The tone was half genuine and half performance, consistent with how he engaged with most public acknowledgments of the show's success. Harmon's approach to discussing the Emmy was more direct in interviews that followed the announcement, framing the award as evidence that the creative risks the show had been taking were being received as intended by people who evaluated television professionally, rather than as a surprise that needed to be processed. The season of which Pickle Rick was a part had been shaped by circumstances that extended well beyond the writer's room. Harmon's divorce and the emotional weight it carried into the production environment, the extended development timeline following Season 2's hiatus, and the pressure that came with returning after 17 months of audience anticipation all created conditions in which the writing reflected a heightened emotional investment. Gao's episode benefited from that atmosphere in a specific way. The therapy session at the episode's center required the show to commit seriously to a psychological reading of Rick and Beth's relationship, and a writer's room operating with less personal emotional investment might have deflected from that commitment more quickly or softened Wong's observations to keep the episode more comfortably within its comedy register. The season's willingness to let difficult material sit without immediate deflection made Pickle Rick possible as the episode it became, rather than as a lighter version of the same premise. The animation quality of the Pickle exoskeleton sequence was specifically noted in critical responses to the episode. The physical build of Rick's improvised machine body, moving from a crude initial assembly to increasingly sophisticated construction across the building sequence, required detailed character animation that tracked the exoskeleton's accumulated components from scene to scene. Bardell Entertainment, the Canadian animation studio responsible for the show's production, handled the physical continuity of the pickle form across a sequence that required more detailed mechanical character work than most Rick and Morty episodes demanded. The choices made in how the exoskeleton moved, how its component parts were visually distinguished, and how its capabilities were communicated through action rather than explanation contributed substantially to how the sequence read for audiences who had no prior reference point for what a pickle navigating a government facility in a rat corpse exoskeleton should look like in motion. Gao subsequently created the HBO Max limited series The Wheel of Time, working as showrunner on a production at enormous scale compared to the individual episode work she had done on Rick and Morty. The path from a single Emmy-winning episode to leading a major fantasy adaptation represents a trajectory that reflects both the recognition the Emmy provided and the creative qualities the episode demonstrated independently of that recognition. The pickle idea that she had carried for years before the right season made it possible to pitch turned out to be the episode that most visibly advanced her career beyond the writer's room where she developed it. Among all the specific episodes across Rick and Morty's run, Pickle Rick occupies a specific cultural position that is partly connected to and partly independent of its quality as an episode. The phrase Pickle Rick became recognizable to people who had never watched the show, circulating through merchandise, memes, and general cultural conversation in a way that most individual episode titles from any animated series never achieve. That circulation attached itself to the episode's most immediately describable premise rather than to its emotional content. For viewers who encountered the reference without context, Pickle Rick meant Rick turning himself into a pickle. For viewers who watched the episode, it meant the therapy session and Wong's silence-producing observations and the specific quality of an episode that used a completely ridiculous premise to deliver something serious without betraying either register in the process. The second Emmy the show won, for the Season 4 episode The Vat of Acid episode, confirmed that Pickle Rick had not been an anomaly in how the Academy received the show's work. 2 Emmy wins in the Outstanding Animated Program category over 5 years established Rick and Morty within the competitive landscape of prestige animation in a way that the first season's modest viewership numbers had given no particular reason to anticipate. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, every Rick and Morty episode follows the same invisible 8-step structure, and the man who designed it built it specifically so that chaos could exist inside it without falling apart. Section 9. The Circle Behind the Chaos. Dan Harmon developed his story structure framework years before Rick and Morty existed, working through what he considered the essential shape of any functional narrative and reducing it to 8 steps arranged in a circle. Every episode of Rick and Morty follows that circle, including the ones that appear to follow nothing at all. The framework is invisible in the finished product by design, operating beneath the surface of whatever content the episode places above it, but its presence is what allows the show's more extreme creative choices to land with emotional coherence rather than simply accumulating as random events. Harmon's path to the framework began with Joseph Campbell's work on comparative mythology and the monomyth, the observation that stories across vastly different cultures and historical periods tend to follow a recognizable structural pattern in which a protagonist leaves a familiar world, passes through a series of ordeals in an unfamiliar one, acquires something meaningful through that process, and returns transformed. Campbell documented this pattern across an enormous range of source material and argued that its persistence across cultural contexts reflects reflected something fundamental about how human beings processed experience through narrative. The work was influential enough that George Lucas cited it directly as a structural reference for Star Wars, and Christopher Vogler later produced a condensed version specifically intended for Hollywood screenwriters that further simplified the pattern into practical terms. Harmon encountered Campbell through Vogler's condensed version and found it genuinely useful as a diagnostic tool for understanding why certain stories worked and others failed, but too long to apply practically within the compressed production timelines of weekly episodic television. A 12-stage framework required a level of detailed mapping that a writer's room working against deadlines could not reliably sustain across every episode of a season. He began condensing it, identifying what he considered the minimum number of distinct structural moments required for a story to feel complete rather than truncated, and working to find a shape that could be communicated and applied quickly enough to be useful in the actual conditions of a television writer's room, rather than only in theory. The result was 8 steps, which Harmon described as his attempt to remove the repeated difficult work of starting a story from scratch each week by providing a reliable structural skeleton that any episode's content could be built around. The 8 steps follow a specific circular path. A character begins in their ordinary world with a defined identity and a settled relationship to their circumstances. That character needs or wants something, a goal or an absence that generates forward momentum. In pursuit of that need, the character crosses into an unfamiliar environment that operates by different rules from the world they came from. Inside that unfamiliar environment, the character searches for what they came for, encountering escalating complications that test their capacity to adapt. The character finds what they were looking for, or something adjacent to it. Taking that find carries a price, a cost that must be paid to bring the acquired thing back across the threshold between the unfamiliar world and the starting point. The character returns to something resembling their original environment. The return reveals that the character has been changed by the journey in ways that distinguish them from the person who left. The circular shape carries a specific implication about what stories actually do. A character who ends in the same place they began, having traveled through an entirely different world in the intervening time, is changed by that travel, rather than restored to an original state. The circle does not represent stasis. It represents a version of the starting point that has been permanently altered by everything that happened along the arc, a home that cannot be returned to unchanged because the person returning is no longer the same person who left. The reason the structure feels emotionally satisfying when it works is that it mirrors a pattern recognizable from actual human experience. The accumulation of consequence through action, the impossibility of returning to an earlier version of a situation as though nothing in between had occurred. Applied to a Rick and Morty episode, the framework accommodates the show's formal extremity without requiring the episode to sacrifice legibility. A typical episode places Morty, or occasionally another family member, in the opening position of the circle, at home, in a recognizable domestic context, with a specific want or problem or absence that the episode's premise will address. Rick's involvement typically functions as the mechanism through which the character crosses into the unfamiliar environment, since Rick provides both the technology and the motivation for departure from ordinary circumstances. The unfamiliar environment varies enormously from week to week, and is where the show's creative invention operates most freely. A planet, a body, a simulation, a bureaucratic system built by alien intelligence, a temporal anomaly. The complications that arise inside that environment generate the episode's plot. The resolution carries a cost of some kind. The return to something resembling home reveals that what happened outside has changed the characters in a way that the episode's final moments register, sometimes through comedy, sometimes through something considerably quieter. What the structure actually provides to the writing room is a quality control mechanism that operates independently of content. The same 8 steps can be applied to an episode about a pickle navigating a sewer, an episode about the family watching television from other dimensions, and an episode about a Morty leading a political revolution inside the Citadel, because the framework asks only structural questions rather than content questions. Does this character have a clear want at the opening? Is there a defined threshold between the familiar and the unfamiliar environment? Is the cost of acquisition real enough that the audience feels it? Does the character arrive at the ending point genuinely changed rather than return to exactly where they started? If those questions can be answered affirmatively, the episode has the structural foundation to carry whatever content the writers have placed inside it. If they cannot, the episode will feel incomplete, regardless of how inventive the surface material is. Harmon had applied the same framework to Community across its run, and the structural consistency it provided was part of what allowed that show to experiment as freely with tone and genre as it did within individual episodes. A Community episode could be a documentary parody, a bottle episode, a film noir homage, or a straightforward character study, and the underlying structure kept each of those formats from feeling arbitrary. Rick and Morty extended that application into territory that Community had not attempted, partly because the science fiction premise expanded the available settings and stakes enormously, and partly because the show was willing to use the structure's flexibility to generate episodes where the emotional cost of the final step was significantly heavier than the content preceding it had obviously prepared for. Season 4's Never Rick and Morty, the 6th episode of that season, used the story circle as its explicit subject, rather than simply as its invisible structure. Rick and Morty Morty find themselves on a train that operates as a literal narrative device, and the episode's plot becomes a metafictional engagement with the mechanics of how stories are constructed and what happens when characters become aware of the structural apparatus controlling their movement. The story train is a direct reference to Harmon's framework, made legible to audiences who knew about it through public discussions of the show's production methods, and accessible as an absurdist science fiction premise to audiences who didn't. The episode functions simultaneously as a standard Rick and Morty story following the circle, and as a commentary on what following the circle means. Harmon's willingness to put the framework on screen and make it the episode's content, rather than keeping it as production infrastructure, demonstrated a level of comfort with the audience's awareness of the show's own mechanics that most television series avoid entirely. The relationship between the circle's consistent presence and the show's reputation for unpredictability is less contradictory than it initially appears. Structural consistency and content unpredictability operate at different levels of the viewing experience. An audience does not consciously track whether an episode satisfies the 8-step framework while watching it. What they register is whether the episode feels complete and emotionally resonant by its conclusion. The framework generates that feeling of completeness reliably because it has been constructed specifically to map the shape of satisfying narrative, which means that episodes built on it tend to close in ways that feel earned, even when the content that arrived at the closing was entirely unexpected. The show can do almost anything it wants inside the circle's arc because the circle guarantees an ending that coheres. That guarantee is what makes the freedom available. Harmon's description of the framework in various public contexts has been consistent in one specific claim, that the circle does not tell writers what to put in an episode, only how to organize what they have. The framework is agnostic about content. An episode in which Morty falls in love with a water-based life form, and an episode in which Rick accidentally becomes the most powerful being in the universe, and an episode in which the family deals with the aftermath of a catastrophic mistake they made in a previous episode, can all follow the same 8 steps without those steps making those episodes feel similar to each other. The content differentiation comes entirely from the writers. The structure only ensures that whatever content is generated will be placed in a sequence that human beings are neurologically disposed to find satisfying, because the sequence reflects the underlying architecture of how narrative experience operates across cultural contexts. Writers joining the Rick and Morty staff have described the framework as both a genuine creative tool and a significant learning curve for anyone arriving from production environments where it was not in standard use. The discipline required to maintain structural integrity across an episode's development, resisting the temptation to skip steps that feel unnecessary for a particular premise, or to add material that the circle cannot accommodate, is a specific skill built through practice rather than absorbed through understanding the framework theoretically. Some episode concepts that seem strong at the pitch stage collapse during the break process when the structural mapping reveals that one or more of the 8 steps cannot be filled satisfyingly by the premise. Other concepts that seem thin at the pitch stage develop unexpected depth when the structural template forces questions that the initial pitch had not addressed. The circle's most demanding requirement for Rick and Morty specifically is the final step, change. Rick Sanchez is a character specifically constructed to resist change, whose relationship to personal transformation is one of refusal and deflection. Each episode that places him inside the structural framework must find a way to land at a changed state for him by the final moments, without violating the core of what the character is. The show's approach to this challenge across multiple seasons has been to locate the change in small concessions, in moments where Rick's behavior reveals something about his interior state that his language refuses to acknowledge, in silences like the one Dr. Wong produced in Pickle Rick, where the character cannot deploy his usual defenses and the gap they leave is registered by the audience as change, even if Rick himself would dispute the characterization. The framework demands the step. The character resists it. The tension between those two forces generates some of the most interesting moments the show produces. By the conclusion of its run through the original 70-episode order placed in 2018, Rick and Morty had applied the story circle across more episodes than Community had across all 6 of its seasons. The consistency of that application across such varied content, from domestic comedy to genuine science fiction tragedy, from improvised interdimensional television to formally ambitious experiments with narrative structure, demonstrated the framework's range more comprehensively than any single example could. Harmon had built a tool specifically to solve a production problem, the difficulty of generating structurally sound stories reliably under weekly production pressure, and in solving that problem, had also built something that allowed the show operating inside it to attempt creative risks that television series without that structural foundation would not have been able to sustain. The 8 steps that Harmon reduced Campbell's work to were not a simplified version of something more complex. They were the minimal version of a complete thing, the fewest possible structural moves required for a narrative to close in a way that satisfied the audience's sense of earned completion. Everything the show placed inside those 8 steps, the science fiction premises, the character dynamics, the comedy, the emotional weight, the formal experiments, all of it was free to be as strange or as serious or as ambitious as the writing room could make it. The circle held it together. The chaos lived inside. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel channel tremendously. Next up, in May 2018, Adult Swim placed an order for 70 new episodes of Rick and Morty in a single deal, a number that changed what the show's future looked like and set a record in American animation history. Section 10, 101. On May 10, 2018, Adult Swim placed an order for 70 new episodes of Rick and Morty in a single deal, the largest single-order renewal in the network's history. The show had aired 31 episodes across 3 seasons at that point. 70 more in a single commitment, more than doubled the existing count, and brought the total commissioned episode number to 101. That figure was not accidental. One episode passed the syndication threshold of 100. The syndication threshold has operated as a significant commercial landmark in American television for decades. When a show accumulates 100 episodes, its library becomes viable for strip syndication, a distribution model where the series can be broadcast across 5 weekdays in a consistent time slot without repeating for 20 consecutive weeks. That scheduling flexibility transforms what a television library is worth to its owners. Before 100 episodes, a show's reruns can only be programmed in limited blocks, cycling through available material too quickly to build a stable audience around it in any given market. After 100, the library becomes a self-sustaining broadcast asset that can generate revenue independently of whatever the show is doing in its active production cycle. Secondary market deals, cable reruns, streaming licensing agreements, and international distribution all become more valuable once a show has cleared that threshold, because the content depth on the other side of it changes the commercial conversation entirely. The Rick and Morty deal landing at 101 was placing the show past the line with something to spare. The timing of the announcement reflected where the show had arrived commercially by the spring of 2018. Season 3 had concluded the previous October, with its finale drawing the highest ratings Adult Swim had recorded across its entire broadcast history. The network had been operating since 2001, building its late-night identity across more than a decade of distinctive animated programming, and a show that had debuted to around 2 million viewers per episode in 2013 had delivered that network's all-time ratings record 4 years later. The viewing numbers, significant on their own, told only part of the story. The measurement that carried the most weight in the negotiations surrounding the deal was the show's performance among younger demographics specifically. Across all of American television in 2017, spanning both cable and broadcast platforms, Rick and Morty ranked as the top comedy among adults 18 to 24 and adults 18 to 34. The Big Bang Theory maintained larger overall audiences. Modern Family had broader household penetration. Saturday Night Live carried decades of institutional prestige. None of them outperformed Rick and Morty on the demographic slice that advertisers pay the highest premiums to reach, and that demographic performance represented a commercial argument for the deal that went beyond what the headline viewership figure communicated alone. Harmon had mentioned in a public interview conducted before the deal's announcement that the contract negotiations had become complicated. He did not elaborate on the nature of those complications at the time, and the full details of what made the negotiation difficult have not been documented publicly in a way that makes them available now. The scale of what eventually closed provides some retrospective context. A commitment covering 70 episodes of a series, as labor-intensive as Rick and Morty, without a fixed timeline for their delivery, required addressing questions that a conventional season-by-season renewal would never have raised. Creative control provisions across a production window potentially spanning a decade. Financial structures accounting for cost escalation across that window. Rights and obligations for both parties if circumstances changed before the commitment was fulfilled. The definition of what constituted satisfactory delivery when no delivery schedule had been specified. Those questions had to be resolved before anyone signed anything, and resolving them with 2 creators who had been producing one of the most commercially significant animated series in cable history required a negotiation process proportionate to the stakes involved on both sides. Harmon and Roiland announced the deal from Harmon's shower. A video posted to Instagram showed Harmon standing in the shower, while Roiland appeared beside him, confirming the renewal in the format of an informal personal moment rather than any kind of corporate press event. The presentation was entirely characteristic of how both creators had conducted their public relationship with the show's audience across its run. Anti-promotional in register, casual to the point of apparent carelessness, and specifically calibrated to feel as distant as possible from the language of institutional announcements, while still conveying the actual news. The largest animated series order in Adult Swim's history was delivered to the public from a domestic bathroom, which was consistent with a show whose Season 3 premiere had aired unannounced on April Fool's Day, without any advance marketing, whose creator had responded to an Emmy win by describing the show as mainstream sellouts, and whose commercial persona had been built from the ground up on the premise that the show and the people making it were indifferent to the performance of their own success. To celebrate the deal, Adult Swim announced a touring pop-up shop called the Rickmobile, a retail vehicle designed to resemble Rick's space cruiser that would make stops at more than 50 locations across the country, beginning May 17th in Atlanta and moving through San Diego Comic-Con in July. The Rickmobile's viability as a touring commercial venture reflected the density of fan communities in cities across the United States that could be expected to turn out in large enough numbers to make the operation worthwhile. A show that had premiered to modest cable ratings in December 2013 2013, had developed, in under 5 years, a fan base substantial enough to support national touring retail. That development did not happen through any single mechanism. It accumulated through the show's sustained presence on digital platforms, where younger audiences consumed content, through the enormous secondary conversation that existed around each new episode across social media and online communities, and through a merchandise culture that had grown around the property in ways that extended the show's presence into everyday life in cities where Adult Swim's late-night broadcast signal had limited direct reach. The production pipeline that the 70-episode deal needed to sustain operated at a pace that made the commitment's open-ended timeline a practical necessity rather than a vague gesture. Stories were developed in the writer's room through Harmon's structured story process, moving from initial premise pitches through detailed outlines before becoming full scripts. Those scripts then entered an animation production pipeline handled by the Canadian studio Bardell Entertainment, which used Toon Boom Harmony for character animation, Adobe Photoshop for background rendering, and Adobe After Effects for post-production refinement. The interval between a story concept passing its initial writer's room approval and the finished episode appearing on a broadcast schedule was measured in months at each stage, and the quality consistency the show maintained across its episodes required that each stage receive the time it needed, rather than being compressed to meet an accelerated delivery target. Roiland's role as the voice of both lead characters added a constraint that no additional resources could address. Recording sessions for Rick and Morty required Roiland specifically. When he was available, the recording moved forward. When he wasn't, it couldn't. That dependency placed a ceiling on how quickly any given season could be completed, regardless of how efficiently every other part of the production operated. Increasing animation crew size or budget allocations could accelerate the visual production pipeline. Neither could accelerate the voice recording process, when the two characters most present in every episode were performed by the same person, and that person had a finite amount of available time in each recording cycle. The production rate that the show maintained across its seasons reflected that constraint as a structural reality rather than as a failure of scheduling. The actual delivery of the 70 episodes played out across the following years in a way that confirmed those production realities at every stage. Season 4 arrived in November 2019, more than 2 years after Season 3 had ended. Its 10 episodes were split across 2 broadcast blocks, with the first 5 airing through the end of 2019 and the remaining 5 returning in May 2020. Season 5 followed in June 2021. Season 6 aired in September 2022. The pattern of roughly 1 season per year, when it held, was itself an achievement relative to the gaps that had preceded it. The audience had waited 17 months between Seasons 2 and 3. The post-deal production rhythm delivered seasons at a pace that, while slower than conventional animation production schedules, was more consistent than the show's early history had established. What the 70-episode structure provided beyond a production commitment was a creative freedom that sequential renewal could not. A show renewed 1 season at a time operates under the implicit condition that disappointing performance in any given season could affect whether the next season happens. That condition shapes creative decisions, often in ways invisible to the audience, but present in the writer's room's risk calculations about how far to push any given narrative development. A show committed to 101 episodes across a single deal has already secured the future in which any creative decision it makes will be able to play out. The storytelling ambition that characterized the later seasons of Rick and Morty, particularly the directness with which Seasons 6 and 7 engaged with the Rick C-137 mythology and moved toward genuine narrative resolution of threads that had been developing since Season 1, reflected that structural security. Committing to conclusions is easier when the episodes needed to reach those conclusions are already guaranteed. When Adult Swim severed its relationship with Roiland in January 2023, the deal's remaining episode count needed to be fulfilled under circumstances that had not been anticipated when it was signed. Both lead characters required recasting simultaneously, which had no real precedent in American animation at the scale the show was operating. The approach Adult Swim took was to find performers who could work as close sonic matches to the existing voices, rather than reimagining the characters through a different vocal register. Ian Cardoni took over Rick's voice. Harry Belden took over Morty's. Season 7 premiered in October 2023, and the critical reception addressed the voice transition as its primary question, largely concluding that the performances were close enough to sustain the show's continuity. The audience numbers that followed confirmed that the transition had not fundamentally disrupted the show's commercial position. Seasons 11 and 12 were announced at a New York Comic-Con panel, pushing the show's future well beyond what the original 70-episode deal had covered. Adult Swim's president said publicly that the team behind the show kept outdoing themselves. Harmon said there were still plenty of places left to go. Both of them were saying the same thing in different words. The show wasn't going anywhere. The 70-episode deal had been a business decision, designed specifically to land 1 episode past the number that makes a series valuable in syndication. But the episodes that filled that number turned out to be something more than a business calculation. They changed what an animated show was allowed to try, and what audiences were willing to sit with. The deal made room for the work. The work made the room worth having.
If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.